My husband stood at the top of our staircase the morning I told him I wanted to go back to work, and he laughed. Not a small laugh. A real one, the kind that bounces off walls. "Audrey," he said, shaking his head slowly, "who in the world is going to hire a 61-year-old woman who hasn't worked in 30 years? Then he walked downstairs and poured himself coffee like he'd just commented on the weather. I stood at the bottom of those stairs. For a long time after he disappeared into the kitchen. 30 years. That number hung in the air around me like something I couldn't quite breathe past. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, has anyone in your life ever made you feel like your years of sacrifice didn't count? I read every single one of your messages. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. People always assume a marriage breaks apart in some dramatic, undeniable moment. A screaming match, a slammed door, a confession that shatters everything at once. But looking back now, I think mine eroded the same way a riverbank does. Quietly, steadily, one small piece at a time, until one morning you look down and realize there's nothing solid left beneath your feet. When I met my husband, Stuart Colby, I was 29 years old and working as a textile designer for a mid-size firm in Cincinnati. I'd spent 7 years building a reputation for color work, the kind of detail-obsessed craft that made clients call back. My manager used to say I could make a room feel like a different season just by changing 2 colors. That mattered to me. It was mine. Stuart was handsome in a quiet, steady way. Not flashy. He worked in commercial real estate and carried himself like a man who always knew which door to walk through first. He was certain about everything. At 29, certainty felt like safety. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party in April, and by the following January, he'd proposed in the parking lot of a hardware store, because, as he put it, he didn't need scenery to know what he wanted. I thought that was romantic then. We married the spring I turned 30. For the first few years, everything felt balanced. I kept working. Stuart's business grew. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood outside Cincinnati with a back porch that looked over a creek. Sunday mornings smelled like coffee and possibility. We danced in the kitchen sometimes. We were happy. Or something close enough to happy that I didn't think to question the difference. Then our daughter Lee was born, and the shift happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it. "It makes more sense financially," Stuart said when Lee was 4 months old. "Your salary barely covers childcare anyway." He said it gently, like he was doing arithmetic, not deciding the shape of my entire life. And maybe he was just doing arithmetic. That's what I told myself. So I stayed home. I told myself it was temporary, a year, maybe 2. Stuart promised we'd revisit it. "You can always go back," he said more than once, and I believed him because I needed to. But years have a way of stacking silently. 1 became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became the whole thing. I cooked. I organized. I drove Lee to gymnastics and later to college visits. I hosted Stuart's business dinners without being asked and never complained about it. I tracked every household expense while Stuart made every financial decision. I knew the price of milk and school supplies and the plumber's hourly rate. Stuart knew the investment portfolio. Somewhere in that arrangement, I disappeared. Not all at once. Never all at once. It happened in sentences. "Let me handle that, Audrey. You wouldn't understand the structure." Or at dinner parties when someone asked what I did, and Stuart would answer before I could. "She keeps the house running," he'd say, smiling. "And everyone nodded like that," explained a person. By the time I turned 55, I couldn't remember the last time someone asked what I thought about something that wasn't related to meals or schedules. The washing machine comment was the one that stayed with me. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Lee was already in college by then, and I mentioned that the dryer was making a grinding noise. Stuart looked up from his laptop and said, "Audrey, do you know how expensive everything is right now?" He said it like I was a child who'd asked for something unreasonable. Like I hadn't stretched every grocery budget for 30 years. Like I hadn't made that money work in ways he never noticed. I apologized. That's the part that still embarrasses me. I apologized for mentioning the dryer. The dismissals had always been there, but they changed texture over the years. At first they felt like impatience, then habit. Then by the time I was 60, they felt like architecture, the invisible structure of our marriage that everything else was built around. Stuart's opinions were facts. My observations were interruptions. His stress mattered. Mine was overreacting. "You've had a comfortable life, Audrey." He said this at our son-in-law Joel's birthday dinner, casually, while I was still carrying plates to the table. "Not everyone gets that." And Joel laughed politely. And my daughter Lee looked down at her fork. "Not everyone gets that." As if comfort canceled out everything else. As if a woman's dignity comes standard with a nice house and a reliable dishwasher. That night I lay awake beside my husband for a long time, listening to him breathe steadily in the dark. I started noticing things after that, subtle things. Stuart taking calls in the garage with the door pulled down. Financial mail that used to arrive for both of us now appearing addressed only to him. One evening, while looking for the homeowner's insurance documents in his desk, I found a bank envelope tucked inside a folder of old tax returns. I almost put it back without opening it. Almost. The account balance was $247,000. Stuart's name only. The mailing address was a P.O. box I'd never seen. My hands went cold. We had always, or so I had believed, shared our finances. I had never been given reason to think otherwise. Stuart handled everything, yes, but I had trusted that handling implicitly. For 30 years, I had trusted it. I stood in his office for a long time, holding that envelope, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen down the hall. I put it back exactly where I found it. Then I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub and breathed. I didn't confront Stuart that night, or the next one. I had learned decades earlier that confronting Stuart without certainty was like bringing a question to a courtroom. He would dismantle it before I finished the sentence, so I waited. And once you start watching someone carefully, you see everything you taught yourself not to see before. He guarded his phone, the way people guard things they're afraid of losing. He left the house some Saturday mornings without explaining where he was going. Small things, possibly innocent things, but the bank envelope made innocent feel less likely. 3 weeks later, I drove across town to an office building near the river and sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside. The sign beside the entrance read Patricia Osei, family law attorney. I had found her name through a neighbor who'd gone through her own divorce 2 years earlier and spoke about Patricia Osei the way people speak about someone who saved their life. What tips? The receptionist handed me a clipboard and a kind smile. I wrote my name on the intake form and stared at it afterward. Audrey Colby, homemaker, no independent income. When Patricia Osei finally called me back, I sat across from a woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that seemed to already know most of what I was going to say. She asked questions calmly and without judgment, and I answered them. About the account, the P.O. box, the financial documents I had no access to, the properties I wasn't sure were still in both our names. 31 years of marriage and you don't have access to retirement accounts? She asked quietly. He always said he'd handle it. Patricia Osei leaned back slowly. Audrey, I want to be clear about something. Decades of unpaid domestic labor inside a marriage is legally recognized as a financial contribution. She paused. You are not powerless here. I hadn't expected to cry at that sentence. I hadn't expected to cry at all. But something about being told plainly by a stranger in a law office on a Tuesday afternoon that my 30 years had counted legally when they had never once been treated that way at home undid something inside me I didn't even know. Was still held together. She gave me a list. Tax returns, retirement account statements, property records, insurance documents. Everything I could locate quietly without alerting Stuart. Don't confront him yet, she said. People who hide money become unpredictable when they realize they've been found. I drove home, feeling like someone had handed me a map to a country I'd been living in blindfolded. Over the next 3 weeks, I became someone Stuart had never imagined I could be, patient, systematic, awake before he was, photographing documents before his alarm went off, careful in a way that felt entirely foreign and entirely necessary. What I found was worse than I expected. Not just one account, a pattern. Transfers, gradual ones, over 6 years, always in amounts that wouldn't trigger obvious flags, and tucked beneath a stack of appraisal reports in the back of the filing cabinet. A deed. A property deed. 12 years earlier, Stuart's parents had gifted us a parcel of land outside Dayton as part of their estate plan. I remembered signing something related to it. I remembered Stuart explaining it briefly, and me nodding because I trusted him, and because I was tired, and because Lee had a recital the following morning. That land had been sold 3 years ago. The proceeds, $91,000, had gone directly into the private account. I sat on the floor of his office with the deed in my lap and didn't move for a very long time. The betrayal arrived in waves after that. Not just the money. The architecture of it, the calculation. For years, Stuart had stood at dinner tables and called himself a provider. He had questioned my $30 purchases while building a private financial life with 6 figures behind my back. He had patted my head, metaphorically and sometimes literally, while treating our shared future as something that only belonged to him. He hadn't just been controlling. He had been preparing. I stopped sleeping well. I moved through the house mechanically, cooking, watering plants, folding laundry, while an entirely separate part of me was already somewhere else, figuring out what to do next. One afternoon I found myself in the storage room behind the garage, looking through boxes I hadn't opened in years. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Some proof, maybe, that I had existed before I became Stuart Colby's wife. The room smelled like cardboard and old summers. I opened boxes slowly. Lee's childhood drawings. Christmas ornaments wrapped in tissue paper from a decade ago. And then, near the bottom of a rusting metal shelving unit, I found a flat plastic portfolio case I recognized immediately. I hadn't seen it in over 20 years. Inside were fabric swatches. Hundreds of them, clipped and labeled in my own handwriting. Color studies, pattern sketches on graph paper. A printed certificate from a textile design conference in Atlanta, 1994. Excellence in surface design, with my name on it. My hands went still over that certificate. Before I became a wife, before I became someone's mother, before I became the woman who managed everyone else's life quietly from the inside, I had been Audrey Hale. The woman who could hold a bolt of fabric up to afternoon light and see 40 possibilities in the weave. The woman whose work had appeared in 3 regional home interiors publications before she turned 30. I sat on the floor of that storage room for a long time. At the bottom of the portfolio, beneath a folded sketch, I found a note card in my mother's handwriting. She had passed 7 years earlier from a stroke that took her quickly, which was, in some ways, a mercy. But losing her had felt like losing the last person on earth who remembered who I used to be. The note was short, just 3 sentences. Audrey, your eye for beauty is a gift. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light through the small garage window shifted. I thought about a woman I used to know. Helen Marsh. We'd worked together at the design firm for 4 years before I left. We'd lost touch. The way you lose touch with people when your life shrinks. But I still knew she'd eventually opened her own studio somewhere in the city. That evening, after Stuart left for a client dinner, I looked her up. She answered on the 3rd ring, and when I said my name, there was a pause and then, Audrey Hale! I was wondering when you'd call. I laughed in spite of myself. It's Audrey Colby now. I know, Helen said, but you've always been Audrey Hale to me. We met the following afternoon at a small coffee shop she liked near her studio. Helen Marsh had aged into herself, shorter silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the unhurried energy of a woman who had stopped performing for other people. She looked at me across the table with the directness of someone who had known me before I learned to make myself small. You look tired, she said. I know. Not just physically. She tilted her head. Something else. And then everything came out, not elegantly, not organized. Just. Out. The account. The deed. Patricia Osei. The 30 years. The staircase. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup. Do you remember the Whitmore Commission? The one you finished the week before you told us you were leaving? I frowned slightly. The hotel project. I still have photographs of those rooms, Audrey. I've shown them to clients. Not as historical reference. She paused. As current inspiration. I looked away quickly because my eyes were doing something embarrassing. Helen set her cup down. Come see the studio. I followed her 2 blocks down the street into a converted brick warehouse with high windows and long wooden tables covered in samples and sketches and color boards. The smell hit me before anything else. Raw fabric and linseed oil and possibility. I stopped just inside the doorway. Helen watched me. You still feel it? I haven't done this in 30 years. Your hands haven't forgotten. Muscle memory doesn't disappear. It just waits. She walked to a supply cabinet and pulled out a set of swatches, rough raw linens in natural tones, and set them on the table in front of me. Just look. Don't think. I stood there for a long moment. Then, slowly, I started sorting them, pulling colors apart, grouping them, feeling the weights. My hands moved before I decided anything. Some instinct that had been sleeping for 3 decades woke up quietly, without announcement. Helen said nothing. She just watched. 20 minutes later, I had a composition on the table that I hadn't planned. And, for the first time since I'd found that bank envelope, I felt something that wasn't fear or grief. I felt like myself. Helen walked around the table slowly. Then she looked at me over her glasses. I have a residential client whose project just stalled because my junior designer left for New York last month. I shook my head immediately. Helen, I haven't worked professionally since before Lee was born. I don't even know what software they use now. I know exactly what software they use. I'll teach you. She crossed her arms. What I cannot teach is what you just did in 20 minutes with those swatches. I drove home that evening with the studio's address written on a coffee napkin in my jacket pocket and a feeling in my chest I couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly. Something closer to the first breath after being underwater too long. 2 weeks later, Stuart slid the divorce papers across the kitchen island with the particular smugness of a man who believes he has already won. You should get a lawyer, he said, as if suggesting I bring an umbrella. You're entitled to certain things. Certain things. After 31 years. I slid the papers back across to him and told him I already had one. The look on his face when he registered that, the slight recalibration behind his eyes, was the first moment I understood that the man I'd been married to for 31 years had never once prepared for the possibility that I might be ready. My new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone 6 blocks from downtown Cincinnati. It smelled like fresh paint and other people's histories. The bedroom window faced east, which meant mornings arrived with actual light. Something I hadn't noticed was missing from our house until I woke up to it one Tuesday and sat on the edge of my new bed just breathing. The first week alone was the hardest. Not because I missed Stuart. I had stopped missing him before I found the bank statement. What I missed was the structure. 31 years of purpose, however narrow, left a shape in the air that silence couldn't fill right away. I ate cereal over the sink my first night there because I hadn't unpacked the bowls. I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m, wondering if I was making an enormous mistake. I replayed Stuart's voice in my head, who is going to hire a 61-year-old woman who hasn't worked in 30 years, with more authority than it deserved. Helen called at 7:30 the next morning. Are you getting up? I'm already up. Then get over here. Client presentation is in 4 days and I need a second brain. I got dressed before I decided to. The studio was already warm when I arrived, light coming through the long windows at an angle that made the fabric samples glow. Helen handed me coffee and a folder without ceremony. The client wants coastal, not nautical, not beachy. Coastal, the difference matters. It did matter, and I knew exactly why. I sat down at one of the long tables and opened the folder. Within an hour, something had shifted inside me without warning. The way a locked door opens when you finally find the right key, and realize you'd been holding it the whole time. I got 2 colors wrong the first week. Helen corrected me, without making it a moment. Different from what you remember. Software's faster, instincts the same. We moved forward. The second month, I worked on the coastal project almost independently. When we presented to the client, a couple redoing their lake house outside of town, the wife looked at the color boards and said quietly, "This is exactly what I couldn't figure out how to describe. How did you know?" Helen glanced at me, I answered honestly. I've been reading rooms for 30 years. I just stopped getting paid for it. The client laughed, and then she asked if I took private commissions. That was the first time I understood that what I had to offer was not rusty. It was ripe. Helen and I began talking seriously about a partnership. Small at first, a shared credit on projects, a desk in the studio, a gradually expanding client list that belonged to both of us. I was terrified every step of the way. Not paralyzing terror, the kind that hums underneath things and makes your hands move faster. One evening in early spring, I was locking up the studio, Helen had left early for a family dinner when my phone buzzed. "Stuart." I stared at the screen, then answered. "Audrey." His voice was flat, unsurprised. "Ethan tells me you're working at a design studio." Our son-in-law Joel had apparently mentioned it to Lee, who had apparently mentioned it to Stuart. "Yes," I said. A pause. "That's temporary, obviously." I pulled on my coat with one hand. "Is it? You're 61 years old. You're doing this for, what, self-esteem? Something to tell people at parties?" Something cold and clear settled in my chest. For years that voice had weight. For years that tone had made me question myself before I finished a thought. "I'm doing it because I'm good at it," I said. "And because it pays." Silence on his end. Then, very quietly, "Don't embarrass yourself." I hung up. My hand shook slightly afterward, but not from what it used to shake from. The project that changed everything was a commission from a hospitality group looking to redesign 3 boutique hotel lobbies across Ohio. Helen brought me in as lead designer on the color and textile direction. The scope was larger than anything I'd worked on since before Lee was born. And for the first 2 weeks, I woke up every morning convinced I'd said yes to something I couldn't deliver. I delivered it. The lead partner of the hospitality group, a woman named Claudine Ferris, flew in from Columbus for the final presentation. She was somewhere in her late 50s, composed, direct. The kind of woman who asked exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. She sat through the full presentation without expression. Afterward, she walked the sample board slowly, touching fabrics, holding color chips to the window light. Then she turned to me. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 8 months," I said. "This iteration." She frowned slightly. "This iteration? I did it for 7 years before my marriage. Then I stopped for 30. Now I'm back." Claudine Ferris looked at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not sympathy, recognition. "My mother stopped painting for 22 years, she said quietly. "She picked it up again at 64. She's 71 now and she's had 2 gallery shows." I nodded slowly. Claudine set down the color chip she'd been holding. "We'd like to move forward. And I'd like your name on the contract, not just the studio's." I called Helen from the parking garage afterward and could barely get the sentence out. Helen laughed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I told you," she kept saying. "I told you." What I didn't know yet was that Stuart had been watching. Not literally. But the legal proceedings had moved into discovery, and Patricia Ossie had begun subpoenaing financial records, and somewhere inside that process, Stuart had started feeling the ground shift beneath him. His attorney had contacted Patricia twice in 1 week. His responses to document requests had been slow and incomplete in ways that suggested stalling, not disorganization. Patricia called me on a Friday afternoon with that careful tone she used when the news was significant. "I need you to come in Monday morning." I arrived to find 3 folders open on her desk and a stillness in the room that told me before she spoke. "The transfers we suspected," she began, "were more systematic than we initially believed." She walked me through it slowly. The private account, yes. But also smaller movements into a joint LLC he'd formed with a business partner 6 years ago. Accounts structured specifically to reduce what would appear as marital assets in the event of divorce proceedings. He hadn't just hidden money. He had built a container to hide it in. "How long had he been planning this?" I asked. Patricia folded her hands carefully. "Based on the earliest transfer dates, at least 5 years. 5 years. While I was making dinner and driving Lee to appointments and organizing his business correspondence, Stuart had been quietly building an exit door with my name nowhere near it. "There's one more thing." Patricia slid a document across the desk. "This refinancing agreement on the lake property. Do you recognize your signature?" I looked at it carefully. Something was wrong immediately, but I couldn't name it at first. Then I saw it, the loop of the A in Audrey, flatter than I ever wrote it, the Y trailing differently. "That's not my signature," I said. Patricia nodded. "We're having it verified, but I want to prepare you." The room was very quiet. "If the verification confirms what we believe," she said carefully, "we're looking at potential criminal exposure on his part, separate from the divorce proceedings entirely." I stared at the document for a long time. I had spent 31 years trusting this man with every financial decision in our shared life. I had signed things he handed me without reading them, because I trusted him. I had deferred and accommodated and made myself smaller so he could feel larger. And somewhere inside all of that deference, he had found the space to steal from me. Not steal from us. From me. I drove home in a state that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something between the two. Colder than either. The call from Lee came that evening. She sounded careful in the way she'd sounded careful for months, trying to navigate the space between two parents without losing her footing. "Mom, can we have dinner? Just us?" We met at a small Italian restaurant near her house. Lee arrived first and was already seated when I walked in. Her father's jaw, my eyes, the particular posture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for longer than they've admitted. She waited until the wine came. Then she said, "Dad called me 3 times this week." I nodded slowly. "What did he say?" "That you're not thinking clearly. That Helen Marsh is taking advantage of you." A pause. "That you're going to end up alone and broke." Something familiar twisted in my chest at that. Not at Stuart. I was past being surprised by him. At the efficiency of it. The way he could wrap control in the language of concern so seamlessly that even his own child sometimes couldn't find the seam. Lee looked at her hands. "I told him I thought you seemed fine." "I am fine." "I know." She looked up. "That's what scared me for a while." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "That if you were fine, if you could just leave and be fine, then what does that say about everything he told us about you?" She shook her head slowly. "He always made it sound like you needed him. Like you'd collapse without the structure he provided. And then you just didn't collapse." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I almost believed him too. Lay's eyes filled. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. You grew up inside it. That changes what looks normal." She nodded, pressing her fingertips to the corners of her eyes. Then after a moment, "Joel and I have been talking about how Dad treats Joel's mother, actually. The comments he makes when he thinks nobody's paying attention." She looked up. "I think we've been making excuses." I reached across the table and held her hand and didn't say anything, because sometimes silence is the only honest response. Before she left, Lee pulled an envelope from her bag. "Joel found this in Dad's email. He wasn't snooping. It came through on a shared account they use for the lake property." She hesitated. "I thought you should see it." I opened it in my car. It was a printed email chain. Stuart and his attorney, dated 2.5 years ago. Subject line: Asset separation. Pre-divorce strategy. I read it once. Then I read it again. She won't push back. Audrey doesn't understand financial structures well enough to challenge anything. And below that, from the attorney: "Are you certain she won't contest a settlement?" And Stuart's reply, 3 words: "Absolutely. She won't." I sat in that parking lot for a long time. He hadn't just taken things from me. He had built his entire plan around the certainty that I was too small, too dependent, too thoroughly diminished to do anything about it. The greatest miscalculation of his life. Patricia Osie's team spent the following month untangling what Stuart's heads had spent 5 years carefully tangling. The forged signature was confirmed. Additional document irregularities surfaced. Stuart's attorney began reaching out more frequently with settlement language that suggested, for the first time, that he was becoming genuinely afraid. He called me himself on a Wednesday evening. "Audrey, I think we should talk directly, without lawyers." "We can do that," I said. "This is getting out of hand. You forged my signature, Stuart." A long pause. "That's one characterization." I almost laughed. "What's another characterization?" "I was protecting assets. From me." He didn't answer that. "Stuart." I kept my voice even. "You spent 31 years convinced I was too passive to fight back. You built an entire financial exit around that assumption." I paused. "I think you're calling me because you're realizing that was a mistake." Another silence. Then, very quietly, "The legal costs alone are—" "I know what they are," I said. "Patricia tells me regularly." He exhaled. "I didn't think it would go this far. You thought I'd take whatever you offered and thank you for it." He didn't deny it. That was somehow the most honest thing he'd done in years. The settlement was finalized on a gray Thursday morning in November. I won't share the specifics because some things don't need to be made into a number. What I will say is that Patricia Osie sat across from me afterward with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has watched justice happen at close range and said, "You did this, all of it." I wasn't sure I believed her entirely, but I was learning how. Claudine Ferris's 3 hotel lobbies opened in February. A regional architecture and design publication ran a feature on the project. My name appeared in the 3rd paragraph, which Lee screenshot and texted me with 11 exclamation points, which made me laugh harder than I had in months. Helen and I formalized our partnership that same month. I got business cards printed with both our names and put one on my bathroom mirror. Not out of vanity, but because there's something important about seeing your own names attached to something you built and being able to look at it without flinching. Stuart reached out once more about 6 weeks after the settlement. A text late on a Sunday evening. Heard about the Ferris project. Congratulations. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the phone down and went back to the design board I'd been working on. 2 days later, Lee mentioned that he had sold the house, that he was living in a smaller place on the east side, that some of the investments had not performed the way he'd projected. I didn't feel victorious at that. I felt something sadder. The way you feel when you finally understand that the person who hurt you was also, underneath everything, deeply afraid. Stuart had spent 31 years building walls because the thought of being ordinary terrified him. He needed to be the provider, the authority, the indispensable center. Not because he loved his family, but because without that position he didn't know who he was. That's not strength. That's a man drowning slowly, holding other people underwater to stay afloat. One evening in early spring, I was in the studio late, finishing color selections for a new residential commission. A woman in her late 60s redoing the house she'd lived in for 40 years after her children had finally left. She wanted it to feel like hers for the first time. I understood exactly what she meant. Helen had gone home an hour earlier. The studio was quiet except for the sound of traffic below the windows and the particular hum of the overhead lights. I was standing at the long table with swatches spread out in front of me, and I looked up and caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked like a stranger, because she looked like someone I used to know and had almost given up on finding again. I went back to work. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, Helen Marsh and I opened a second studio space, a larger one, with room for 2 junior designers and a proper client meeting area with good natural light and chairs worth sitting in. We took on a mentorship program the following year, offering quarterly workshops for women returning to design careers after long absences. The first cohort had 7 women. The youngest was 52. The oldest was 68. The 68-year-old designed the best color system I've seen in years. Lee and Joel came to our studio opening and stood in the middle of the space for a long moment, just looking at it. The work on the walls, the samples on the tables, the small bronze nameplate beside the door that read Hale Marsh Studio. Lee turned to me at one point, eyes bright, and said, "Mom, this is yours." And she was right, not just the studio, something else, something harder to name but easier to live in. I had spent 31 years being told in 100 quiet ways that my value was conditional, that I existed in relation to other people's needs, that comfort was the same thing as fulfillment, and arrangement was the same thing as choice. What I know now is that I was never as dependent as Stuart needed me to believe. He needed me dependent. Dependence was his control mechanism, his architecture, the foundation his entire self-image was built on. The moment I stopped performing helplessness, everything he'd constructed started to crack. The morning I told my husband I wanted to go back to work, he stood at the top of the stairs and laughed. What he didn't know, what neither of us knew yet, was that the moment I heard that laugh and didn't take a step back, something in me had already decided. Not to hurt him, not to prove anything to him specifically, just to stop disappearing. And it turns out when you stop disappearing, you don't become less. You become exactly as much as you always were, finally in a place where you can be clearly seen. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe. I read every comment. I'd love to know. Have you ever had to rediscover something in yourself that someone else convinced you was gone? Tell me below. And wherever you're watching from today, I'm glad you're here.